is put in a standing offer for departments, agencies, and crowns to then call up against.
Thank you very much. In this audit of McKinsey contracting, you found that the NMSO established by Public Services and Procurement for McKinsey was done through a non-competitive process for benchmarking services, and they did not provide proper justification. I think you mentioned that that happened in a number of contracts. I believe this calls into question whether it should have been established to begin with at all. Would you say that is accurate?
Well, I think the procurement rules allow for national master standing offers to either be put in place for a competitive process or a non-competitive process. Prior to the issuance of this NMSO for McKinsey, there were others that had been issued to other vendors on a non-competitive basis, and this one was done on a non-competitive basis as well. I found that Public Service and Procurement Canada's justification was really weak. Then the next step is when departments, agencies, or crowns use it, that each of them should have properly documented why choosing the McKinsey National Master Standing Offer versus another one where similar services might have been available.
Okay, thank you. So I know you didn't use these words, but the OPO said that there appeared to be clear favoritism when it came to how some of these contracts were structured. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would tell you that we found 6 instances where we thought that the process was designed to suit or favor McKinsey, so 6 out of 97.
So favoritism. So what we actually have here is a government setting up a pipeline to funnel tens of millions of dollars through a non-competitive process to one of their favorite companies, McKinsey.
A question, Ms.
Would
Block,
you agree
please.
with that?
I would tell you that McKinsey represents 0.27% of the dollars spent by the federal public service on professional services contracts. And I think it's important to note that the government should properly document why contracts are needed, regardless of who they are issued to.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weiler, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I do want to thank the Auditor General and her team for the important work you've done on these reports and for being here today to answer our questions about them. I do want to ask some questions about your report on Sustainable Development Technology Canada. This is something I know that the suspension of funding from this organization is causing a lot of challenges in our clean tech sector in Canada, where we need to have access to finance to be able to compete with some of our international competitors. But there were some very significant findings that were made in your report, including 90 instances where funding for projects were approved when conflict of interest policies were not followed. I would like to ask a question, though. How many of those instances were related to the 5% across the board COVID relief payments that were delivered to all SDTC clients?
So in the 90 cases, there was 63 of them that were linked to the 2 payments that were made around COVID relief.
Okay, so those were just across the board without actually specifically choosing individual companies by the board for those cases.
Yeah, the way the COVID payments were done, I think, violated two things. One, the conflict of interest rules not being properly followed, since individuals who had conflicts of interest did not recuse themselves from the vote. But secondly, it was done in a blanket format, so it was all at once. And the contribution agreement between the Government of Canada and the Foundation does not allow for that. It requires that each individual contract and payment be looked at on a merit basis and awarded to a specific project. So this violated not only the contribution agreement, but their conflict of interest rules.
Thank you. And could you explain some of your recommendations for related to conflict of interest in your report?
So I think it starts with the fact that the foundation really just has a poor system to manage their conflicts of interest and the mitigation measures. So we believe that they should have a system, which they put in place near the end of, I think, 2022. But again, we saw inconsistencies between what had been declared in minutes and then what was maintained in this system. So I do think that they have a lot of work to do around managing conflicts of interest at the board. But more specifically, they also have other conflicts of interest not covered by their policies, and we cited a few examples that they should really improve on. I would also point to you that there was a recommendation around conflict of interest in our professional services contract. So it's important to be much more proactive when it comes to conflicts of interest. And I think Mr. Hazel maybe add something about one of the specific recommendations.
I think it's important to mention that there is also a recommendation that ISED, the department, should be also monitoring and ensuring that it assesses challenges, conflict of interest at the foundation. So there is an oversight role that ISED should be playing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And could you also go over your recommendations regarding project eligibility, including kind of what went wrong with this and what are the implications for your recommendations?
So you're asking me to remember a lot of specifics. I'm going to see if Mathieu wants to join in on here, but I think I would say overall it's about making sure that when the awarding of public funds is done, that it follows the structure, the governance structure that was agreed to between the federal government and the foundation. It's actually clearly set out in the contribution agreements between the government and the foundation. And the board really failed to comply with those requirements. They created a stream that we believe doesn't even meet the mandate of the foundation, which is some of the contracts that we believe received funds in an ineligible way. So it's about going back to basics and following that contribution agreement. Mathieu, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and as we said in the report, the material for the discussion around the eligibility of project are minutes and record of decision, board minutes, and PRC project committee review, and they're very concise, they're very high level, so it's very difficult as an auditor to understand what was the level of engagement, the level of discussion for specific project.
Thank you. And just with my last question here, based on your experience, your general experience in audits, what are some of the challenges with arm's length organizations such as SDTC and how they face in regards to accountability and process?
Well, so in the federal government, foundation is a unique one because you have the departments and agencies, and then at arm's length you have the crown corporations, and then at further arm's length you can have a foundation like Sustainable Development Technology Canada. That foundation has its own board and its own governance structure, and it's then asking the federal government for funds to disperse. So it's meeting a policy objective, but it needs to remember is that it's actually dispersing public funds. And this is where I think Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada come in and play an important role. They have an oversight role to ensure compliance with that contribution agreement, but also the prudent use of public funds. And while they did some monitoring, they did not do enough. They should have been asking about conflicts of interest to make sure it was properly managed. Public servants are held to a higher standard, and this foundation should have been held to that same standard and dealt with conflicts of interest properly. I can tell you that the department throughout the audit reacted quickly and already started to make changes to how they interact with this foundation and others.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Secrétaire Desgagnés pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. First things first, could you very simply confirm that you are able to provide the two following lists? First, the list of the 90 cases where conflict of interest rules were not followed at Sustainable Development Technology Canada, and second, the list of the 10 projects which were ineligible but which were funded anyway. Could you provide these lists to the committee? Yes, I can't give them to you now, but I can provide them to the committee. Chair, could you please follow up and make sure that the information is provided? We'll talk about that afterwards. As we noted, your information, the information becomes committee information. We could perhaps publish it on the website. Well, just inform the committee members of the final decision. Oh, certainly, I'll do that. Just because it's an important issue. Now, back to non-competitive contracts. one counterargument that the government might raise is that standing offers are sometimes even more competitive because even though they are considered non-competitive. I feel that that's false. As you noted in the report, with McKinsey, the standing offer was determined on a non-competitive basis. Is that correct? Yes. So, 71% of contracts were awarded to McKinsey in a non-competitive way, totaling $118 million that went directly to McKinsey. Yes, just to clarify, 20 contracts were awarded via a standing offer. The other were awarded through a typical non-competitive process. Oh, certainly. But in that 71%, we are including the standing offer. Yes. I just want to make sure that you don't walk away with the impression that the 71% were awarded via the standing offer. Oh, no, I am entirely clear on the details. This is all quite concerning. And I have a general question for the government. Do you think this is the case for all companies doing business with the government, given that the McKinsey represents 0.27% of government spending on consulting services? Do you think that non-competitive contracts are now standard practice in the government? It's hard to say. I observed that the lack of justification tends to be a common problem, but with the scale of money being provided to one specific company, I don't know if that extends beyond McKinsey. There you are. Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Auditor General, you mentioned that 0.27% of contracts were given or awarded to McKinsey and Company since 2011. Is that correct?
That's the percentage of the dollar value.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah. So if you look, there's two exhibits in our report. Sure. There's about $5 billion spent on professional services contracts over the 12-year period, and McKinsey is 0.27% of that.
So 0.27% of all dollars awarded to professional services, private for-profit entities.
Correct.
Correct?
It's for certain contracts. Oh, thank you. He's providing a clarification for me. So the Public Accounts of Canada lists many different types of professional services contracts. McKinsey is only in certain buckets. If there's been 8 buckets, McKinsey's in 6 of them. So there's 0.27% of all funds spent in those 6 buckets out of 8 professional services. Those are arbitrary numbers.
But it paints a picture for the fact that this issue is immense. And I think that's why you pointed this figure out, that it's not an issue of McKinsey and Company, which it is in some parts, I believe, but 0.27% of all those funds demonstrate that 99% of professional service dollars is awarded, but that the issue that you're describing here, which is that the government failed to guarantee that these certain companies were worthy of receiving contracts and Canadians getting money or value for their money, is the overarching or larger concern here, correct?
Well, and that's why I said that I don't believe that our findings are unique to McKinsey. I believe that we'll likely see that rules weren't paid attention to with other professional services contracts, but even more general around procurement. We often see that the justification for non-competitive contracts is incredibly weak. And there are a lot of rules to follow in procurement, and the fact that the frequency of disregard here was many different aspects, whether it be...
Why doesn't the government just follow the rules? Like, why?
which is exactly why I don't believe this is about more rules, but about following existing rules. And I think that the government needs to ask themselves that. Is it because the rules are so complex that folks try to go around them in order to get contracts out quickly? Or is it that rules are so complex that there's so many of them that you don't know them all and can't apply them? I really think it's something that public service needs to figure out, because they're meant to promote fairness and transparency and good value for Canadians, and they really only work if they're used.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to give you one last spot, Mr. Desjardins, so we'll come back to you. Ms. Kuzi, I understand you're splitting the next 5 minutes with Mr. Caputo.
That's correct.
Will you hand it off to him, or do you
I
want me?
will hand it off.
Very good. You
Thank
have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madam Auditor General. Again, I'm going to go back to an individual who has been intrinsic to this study, and that is Mr. Dominic Barton. I'm sure you're aware Mr. Dominic Barton is the former global international leader of McKinsey. Mr. Barton is also the Prime Minister's hand-picked appointed ambassador to China. Mr. Barton was also his chair of his Economic Advisory Committee. So the infiltration of McKinsey in this Liberal government runs deep, and it doesn't stop there. To go on, Dominic Barton attested himself in Government Operations Committee that he had dinner with the Deputy Prime Minister. We saw the Prime Minister warmly introduce Dominic Barton at an international event. Mr. Barton has also met with Katie Telford, as well as Gerald Butts. So as I said, Mr. Dominic Barton, the former international head of McKinsey, is no stranger to this Liberal government. But on February 1st, 2023, Dominic Barton testified, not at this committee, but at Government Operations Committee, and he lied. He lied about attending a strategic meeting with the Canada Infrastructure Bank on June 23rd, 2020, when he was Canadian ambassador to China. And today is confirmed in your report that the Canada Infrastructure Bank received not one, not two, but 3 contracts from McKinsey, with McKinsey. So, Madam Auditor General, my question to you is, on what dates were each of these 3 contracts awarded to McKinsey?
I'm going to have to get back to you on the specifics of dates. I don't have that level of information on all 97 contracts at my fingertips today.
Okay. Please ensure that you do that, because determining those dates will be very interesting to corroborate with the previous testimony that we have from Mr. Barton, where we have seen that he has lied before to a parliamentary committee. And I would not put him past him to find that these dates corroborate with his implication with both McKinsey as well as the Liberal government. I also think it's important to point out, you mentioned in your report the SDC and defense wait times of 1 year. I can't help but wonder if Mr. Barton's implication has something to do with that as well as the contracting chains. And with that, I'll pass my time over to Mr. Caputo.
Thank you, Ms. Kuzi, and thank you for being here. Madam Auditor General, I want to direct your attention to 7.46 and 7.47, those paragraphs in your report, speaking about cybercrime. Specifically, I want to ask you about the fact that it appears that the CRTC had seized devices in relation to an anti-spam investigation. And on those devices was evidence of another offense unrelated to the anti-spam investigation. Am I correct so far?
Yes, you're correct in that the CRTC seized devices as they were investigating an allegation against the anti-spam legislation. During that investigation, they uncovered that a law enforcement agency had a criminal investigation ongoing. I do not know the nature of that criminal investigation.
So it was a separate criminal investigation, and the CRTC provided a digital evidence to the law enforcement organization. And the CRTC was then made aware that the police were going to be applying or had applied for a search warrant, and a search warrant would be coming. In the meantime, they stated that the data had been deleted off the devices. In other words, they went to the owner of those devices, the CRTC did, knowing a warrant was coming, asked for permission, received permission, and then deleted evidence from devices that the RCMP were going to seize pursuant to a warrant before the police obtained the warrant. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the CRTC was informed of the possibility of being served with a warrant after they had provided the electronic information to law enforcement. In an expedited fashion, they did accelerate cleaning the devices or deleting the contents of the devices and returning them. The incorrect information they provided to law enforcement was around the timing. When they had told them that the devices had been wiped, that had not yet occurred.
So not only were they incorrect or lied, they actually deleted evidence that would be seized. Now, can your office please provide this committee with all communications from the CRTC in relation to that, including all individuals and their titles who were involved?
Mr. Chair, we can provide that information. I believe that Mr. Hayes would like to.
Sure, I want to say a few words in that.
Yeah, one clarification, it was the Granby Police, not the RCMP, that we were talking about in the report there, although we did not name that organization. And yes, we will provide you with the information that we can on the individuals involved in the documents that we have.
Thank you.
Very
It sounds
much.
like it could
Thank
be
you. Thank you very much,
obstruction of
Mr.
justice,
Caputo.
so thank
That
you.
is the time, unfortunately. Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And again, I'd like to thank the Auditor General for being here today with her team to provide these 3 reports to us. It's as is often the case, there are overriding themes to the reports, and I'd like to ask the Auditor General a couple of questions around, namely the conflict of interest rules. That's the one recommendation that you brought forward in the professional services report. But I must say, given that the scope of this report was from 2011 to 2023, when I was sitting on this committee in the 42nd Parliament, many of the reports that we were seeing from the Auditor General at the time had to do with, for example, in disability payments, unconscionable delays in delivering service. We know what was going on during that time, and that was many cuts to the public service. And so I'm wondering what was going on in the public service from that time. Where was it a lack of capacity? Was it a lack of guidelines how to address conflict of interest and how to provide proper documentation? Was it a lack of oversight? What were some of the causes, do you think, Auditor General, to this problem?
This is a really big question spanning 12 years. I mean, the public service has changed so much over the course of 12 years. I would start by telling you that as an auditor, if you haven't documented something, it didn't happen, right? So it's important to, if you're making a judgment call or if there is a potential conflict of interest, that you ensure that you're properly documenting decisions, mitigating measures. It's all about being transparent. I think I would come back to those fundamentals. It's about showing transparency and accountability to Canadians. I think there's a bigger, broader conflict of interest conversation going on now across the public service. And you're right that many of the reports from my office over the last 12 years have noted issues. Most recently, I've done that as well. Conflicts of interest, you need to worry about real conflicts and also the perception of conflicts of interest. An individual shouldn't be seen to have benefited from public funds, and you need to make sure as a public service that you set up your personal life and your work life in such a way that they don't interfere. You always need to look unbiased and fair to Canadians. And what we found at a Sustainable Development Technology Foundation was really a significant lapse in the management of conflicts of interest. The one recommendation we issued under our professional services contracts was to provide clarity and be more proactive, to declare if you have a potential conflict of interest when you're part of a committee that is evaluating bids in a competitive process. Competitive process should be the way to go. And when you do that, you want to make sure that there are no biases that are introduced in those evaluations. And we believe that relying on the annual declaration for public servants isn't enough. You should be much more proactive. In fact, we saw certain Crown corporations, especially Export Development Canada, being really good at doing that. And that's why we felt the recommendation should be to all in this audit. But I would say more generally, everyone in the public service should be thinking and talking about conflicts of interest so that we manage them better.
Well, thank you for that, Auditor General, because you have testified in other instances where the public service, when they have programs, something that they have to deliver, that using professional services is not something that is untoward, but that there must be a justification for it. And I can only think that with the pressure on the public service, for reasons that we all know over the last 12 years at different times, that must have been, that certain practices must have crept in and were not properly addressed. Would you say that that could be addressed by and I know you have said it, but I just want to hear it from you again. Do we need to add more rules? What would be the game changer here?
I think your question touches on an important element of determining that should be done by everyone at the start of a procurement process. Before you decide you want to issue a contract, you should figure out, what do you need this contract for? Is it to help with capacity issues? Is it to fill a skills gap? Or is it because you want to go get a different perspective, a different way of doing things? Once you've done that, then you figure out the right procurement vehicle to meet your needs. And I have said it before, and you're right, it isn't about creating more rules here. It's about applying the existing rules, but that really comes with making sure that everyone understands those rules, their individual accountability in a procurement process, and then documenting when you need to make justifications or exceptions. And issuing contracts on a non-competitive basis is an important exception that should be well justified and documented.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have a lightning round here. Members of the government official officers will each have 2 minutes, and the other two parties 1 minute each. Mr. Berthold, vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, Madame Hogan. Ça me fait plaisir.
Thank you. Great to see you, Ms. Hogan. Ms. Hogan, I've looked at the 3 titles of your press releases. We see that they describe a lack of rule following, flaws in the processes governing sustainable development technology Canada. You talk about how the government has a disconnected approach to combating cybercrime. These reports contain more problems than we've seen in all your prior reports. There are some serious issues facing the government. What is your response? The scale of the violations of procurement procedures and rules governing public funds vary from one organization to another. Here we see an overarching problem bringing together Crown corporations and departments. The government needs to take a step back and make sure that all of its officials understand and are able to apply their policies. If I understand you correctly, we're seeing favoritism, a lack of rule following, management issues throughout the government. So it's time to send a clear message to the entire public service. This situation is unacceptable. What I get from all this is that there needs to be stronger oversight, be it for procurement or the governance of foundations. There needs to be robust oversight of the use of public funds and adherence to laws and rules. I have cited a number of examples at this committee meeting which are concerning for me. And if the government were in front of me, I would say get back to basics and properly manage public funds. Anything new you'd like to add? I wouldn't add any new rules. I would talk more about the need to follow existing rules. And I would look into the root cause of what's going on. Are there too many rules that are too complicated and hard to follow? If so, the public service needs to take a look at that. But At the most basic level, it needs to follow existing rules.
2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Auditor General, in your opening statement, you mentioned the total value of contracts awarded to McKinsey & Company during the period we reviewed totaled $209 million, of which $200 million was spent. What happened to the other $9 million?
So as I mentioned earlier, there's 97 contracts here, and they're all kind of unique. But I would cite probably two things. One is that the contract is either still ongoing, so they perhaps could spend the full amount of the contract. But in other instances, the ceiling or the full amount of the contract was not spent.
Your report makes it clear that rules were not followed adequately during the awarding of professional service contracts, and some of my colleagues have focused their questioning on the awarding of contracts to McKinsey. Can you please remind us again the percentage of dollars that went to McKinsey?
So when you look at the bucket of professional services that McKinsey provided and compare it to the spend across the public service for professional services contracts, McKinsey accounts for 0.27% of that spend.
How statistically significant is 0.27%?
It's a tiny percentage.
That's right.
But the problems, I think, are not unique to McKinsey, right? The problems are something that I would expect to see more broadly across professional services and contracting, and that's why everyone needs to be reminded of, all the rules and the importance of following them for transparency and accountability.
What are some of the changes that SDTC made quickly in the light of your report?
Some of the changes that SDTC made?
Yes.
Quickly in the light of our report, I'm good. I think it was more that Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada, so the department that is responsible to monitor the compliance with the contribution agreement between the government and the foundation, they made changes very quickly. They clarified the role of an observer that might sit on the board of directors of a foundation, and they improved their information requests from this foundation and others in order to have better information to monitor the use of public funds and the management of conflicts of interest.
Thank you very much. Suivant pour seulement une minute.
For 1 minute only, Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés. When awarding a contract to the business of the government's choice, it looked like the government is willing to do anything to avoid following the rules. In one example, you described chain contracting. For Canada Post, for example, here's a serious example. For one goal, that is revenue diversification, they gave 7 contracts totaling roughly $17 million. So this is really one $17 million contract that's spread across a bunch of smaller ones, and yet that skirts the rules surrounding competitiveness. When a number of contracts are awarded in a short period of time for similar reasons, I start asking questions. I start asking questions about why. That's why we suggest the government should think about why they really need any given contract. After that, then they can decide how to award it. I would add, in this specific case, it's difficult to tell whether McKinsey even did its job. Not for Canada Post, however. Canada Post isn't exactly more profitable after all of this. That's a whole other kettle of fish. Sorry.
You have the floor for just a minute, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do want to focus again on this pattern that's very evident. It's important to name the problem. The problem, in my mind, and I think it's referenced in your report, and there's credible evidence to suggest that these professional fees, and your report here, McKinsey & Company represents 0.27% of all professional fees across all of those buckets you mentioned. Is that correct?
Yes, over the period audited, yes.
So over the period audited, 2011 to 2023, McKinsey and Company received 0.27% of all professional fees. Is that another way of saying that truth?
For the services that McKinsey provides, yes.
And so the other 99% went to like companies.
Correct.
And so the issue you're mentioning is an issue not of rules or regulation, but of following those rules and regulations, correct?
Absolutely, and that's why I think I want to recognize that procurement officers in the public service have a great will and desire to follow the rules, and I question whether there are just too many, or that they're complicated, because the amount of the frequency of the disregard that we saw here makes you question. I think the most important part is to recognize that when you're issuing a non-competitive contract, there are a lot of rules that you really do need to follow, and it starts with justifying why you're selecting that vendor or what exception you're applying. And when you start off not by respecting one of the most important rules, then it's probably a little easier to see how it repeats itself.
Thank
Is it
you
fair to
very
say it's a
much.
tradition?
I'm afraid that is the time we are, unless the auditor has a quick answer.
It's a concern.
Yes, very good. Thank you. Ms. Kuzi, you have the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Madam Auditor General, can you please fill Canadians in as to the nature of the Trans Mountain contract, please?
There was a contract issued by Trans Mountain Corporation to McKinsey and Company to provide advice on operations, sort of monthly how to be more efficient and how to save money. That contract was issued on a non-competitive basis. It did not have a limit, but they expected that they would spend about $19 million. To date, they have spent $32 million on that contract.
Thank you. And who is the minister that signed that contract, please?
I don't believe that contract was signed by a minister. We only saw one contract where a minister had to authorize the approval of it, given that it exceeded the thresholds that the public service could authorize, but that was not this contract.
Thank you. I will pass my time to Mr. Perkins.
Auditor General, you mentioned the issue of adhering to standard conflicts of real and perceived conflicts. 5 of the 7 NDP Liberal appointees to the Green Slush Fund Board as
Point of order.
voted themselves money.
I find it misleading to suggest that the NDP in any way appointed these individuals, and I think the Auditor General can confirm that.
Point of debate, I would suggest, since Mr. Perkins is on the clock, he just laser focusing on his question here.
I'll start again. The appointments that were
You have
made
45 seconds.
The appointments that were made by the Liberal government with the support of the NDP to the Green Slush Fund, 5 of the 7 directors as a group voted themselves 186 times money for companies they own in the conflict of interest. Isn't the easiest way to avoid a conflict of interest to not have the organization, the government organization you're representing or being on the board of, not do business with your companies?
So I guess I would talk a bit about how the board members were appointed to the foundation. Half of them are appointed by the. I'm gonna get to the answer. Half of them are appointed through the governor in council process, which is supposed to be a process that's independent. We did not look at that.
Okay, order. Or Mr. Perkins, Mr. Perkins. We're listening to the auditor. There'll be no more interruptions. There'll be other opportunities if you're unsatisfied with the answers, but we find Ms. Hogan does get to the point. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor, and your time is expired. This is extra time that I'm giving to Ms. Hogan to respond to your question. Mr. Perkins, if you're not interested in a response, I will move on. There's a fair bit of chirping coming 2 ways. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor, please.
So the other half of the board of directors are appointed by this member council, and they're supposed to represent the Canadian population and the industry. So I think when you have that composition of a board of directors, it is likely that you will see conflicts of interest, which is why it is so important if you want the expertise of the industry at the table, that you have a good process to manage conflicts of interest. And what we found here is that the foundation did not have that. And in 90 cases, their records showed that members of the board had declared a conflict of interest and voted on giving funding, and that should not have happened.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weiler, you have the last 2 minutes. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Hogan, I want to touch on the last question that I asked you. You mentioned that there's an oversight role for ISED to ensure that these conflict of interest rules are followed. I was hoping you can expand on what you would like ISED to do in this regard, and are you satisfied or encouraged with what you've heard from ISED to date to ensure that's going to take place?
So the department did provide a response to our recommendation, and it's actually a pretty good one to the recommendation. ISED's role when it comes to the oversight of a foundation, in this case, they were required to inquire about conflicts of interest. As I mentioned in the previous answer, when you want to have individuals who are knowledgeable in the industry on the board helping to approve which projects gets funding, it is likely that there will be situations of real or perceived conflict of interest, and that's why they should be well managed. So ISED just received the minutes from the foundation, and as we noted, the minutes were not a good record. So I would have expected that they would have been much more proactive in finding out about real or perceived conflict of interest and the mitigation measures, and they just didn't do that. So I will look forward to see how they're going to resolve this with this foundation and others that have a similar governance structure.
Okay, and just last question here. Can you just explain the ethics violations reports of the finding and how those were received? Was that based on consulting with employees from SDTC or with every company that had received funding? Or I just kind of curious to understand how you came about with those findings.
With the findings of the conflicts, the 90 conflicts
with the ethics violations,
the cases. So a board member, staff at the foundation, consultants at the foundation are all given a conflict of interest policies that exist at the in the foundation, and they must proactively declare when they have a link to an organization that may be applying for funding with the organization. That declaration is then included in the minutes of the board of directors or the project review committee that looks at all of the projects. I would have expected that the foundation would have then been a little more proactive and say, well, there's certain documentation you shouldn't get, certain conversations you shouldn't be part of. But because they didn't have a way to manage this, that proactiveness didn't happen. It rested then with the individuals to recuse themselves. And what we found is that the records did not show that took place in 90 cases. They did show that it took place in 96 other cases. So it's clear that at times it was well managed, but there are 90 cases that really were not properly managed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming in today. Just a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, thank you, Auditor General, and your entire team for kicking us off on another round of studies that we're going to take up as a committee. For committee members, there'll be a meeting this afternoon on the subject of Report 2, Housing and First Nations Communities at a regular time, 3:30. To the OAG, there's been a request for several documents today, and I believe we will get them as soon as possible. Those documents will be sent through the clerk and then distributed to members. On the point that Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, I'm going to reaffirm the discussion and my view as chair, which is reinforced by the House administration. Once these documents are sent to the public, they are deemed to be public documents. You can do with them what you like. So I'm going to leave that for members to decide. You can raise them in the House. You can write about them. You can do whatever you want with them. They are considered by the chair and the House administration to be public documents, unless, of course, the auditor comes forward and requests that a document not be made public. That has not happened today. They'll be sent to you. Finally, just a point to the auditor. I just want to reiterate that I'm perplexed by, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to it as a committee, and that is in the report on the cybercrime that the Canada Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission has not validated your audit or seems to question the underpinnings. I'm not looking for an answer. I just wanted to highlight that. I'm anticipating that might come up for a future study, or could even come up in your questions with the media today, because that to me is not just questioning recommendation, but the very underpinning. It's as if you and the CRTC are on two different worlds, and you're not even seeing eye to eye. I don't know if you want to respond to that. You don't need to. I just want to flag that. If you'd like a few minutes, please, the mic is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, it's always concerning when an organization doesn't want to agree with the factual accuracy of our reports. And I spent personally, in addition to the team, a lot of time with the CRTC. I would tell you it would boil down to us just not being in the same place on what the expectations are of them to discharge their responsibilities under the Canada anti-spam legislation. And the categorization of their own internal policies. I believe when it comes to cases that affect the most vulnerable in our society, our children, that they should have acted and properly alerted the RCMP, which is why I took that action.
This meeting is adjourned. We'll see you at 3:30.